Good evening, saints, sinners, believers, unbelievers, whosoever will. Welcome to the Alpha Ministries podcast, live broadcast. I don't know what to call this thing, but we are coming to you live and in color. And it's good to be with you tonight. We're not going to be talking about rainbows and kittens and butterflies tonight. We're going to be talking about hatred. And I think it's very timely because there's a lot of hatred in the world right now. We're going to talk about resentment. And there's a lot of euphemisms for hatred, but hatred is hatred, right? And the opposite of love is hate. Okay, God is love. The opposite of God is hate. And the funny thing about religion is religion will allow you to hate. Religion will allow you to hate the people that are not in with God. And as you can see, the history of this world, the wars and the hatred, it all had to do with religion. And if God hates people and you're in with God, that you can hate those people too. And it's a bunch of rubbish. On a daily basis, I have to deal with my resentment against the politicians because they have so slickly done a very good job of getting people to hate each other, which they take advantage of it. They prosper from Americans being divided and hating each other. So hatred's real. Hatred tears the world apart. Hatred tears families apart. Hatred tears relationships apart. So as we begin, remember we've been talking about emotions the last few weeks. And what I've noticed, and John Glenn and I have talked about this, if we do a 12-week class on the Alpha series and emotions is about week 4 or 5, dealing with hatred, the percentage of the class drops off. The percentage of the class, there'll be a lot less people there the next week after we ask people to deal with their hatred. I used to, when we were doing it for the Net Institute years ago, we would do a Friday night class and then Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon. We would break it up into 3 parts. It was very intense study on the Alpha series. But I noticed how squirrely people were after doing emotions on the break. You can see them, you can just see it and you can feel it. The hatred is something that Christians don't admit to it because, well, there's passages where Jesus said, that hatred was wrong, but he says, if you even, are angry with your brother or say you fool to your brother, you're in danger. So Christians don't they don't want to admit it because a good Christian wouldn't hate anybody. So we deny it and stuff it. I remember there was a girl, I was friends with her family and they asked me to kind of help her out. She had an eating disorder. So we talked and I said, hey, well, I'm going to an Alpha class tonight. Why don't you go with me? And it just so happened that she popped in there when John Glenn was teaching about hatred. And when we were leaving, she goes, I can't deal with this. She goes, later for you, God. She literally said that. Later for you, God, it's not time to deal with this. It was Alec, not that clown, James Baldwin, the playwright. James Baldwin, the playwright, said that people don't want to deal with hatred because when they do, they'll have to deal with pain, right? They'll have to deal with pain. See, under that hatred is a lot of pain. And if you start dealing with the hatred, you're going to have to face the pain. And hatred feels a little bit better than pain. In one of my, I go to a grief support group, and there was a woman whose son committed suicide, and she had been in the group for 3 or 4 years, and I was new to the group, and she talked about her husband. She said her husband's he never really dealt with his grief. He's just angry all the time, full of anger and hatred. And I talked to her a little bit afterwards, and I said that anger and hatred feels better than the pain of the grief of losing a child, especially the suicide. The anger and hatred feels a lot better. So dealing with hatred, it's tough. And I never realized how much I hated because I just stuffed it. And I even remember after I dealt with my hatred, I remember calling John Glenn, and I said, John, can you believe this? I had two daughters, 2 stepdaughters. I said, Carrie said that, Sarah and Haley are afraid of me. And what's that all about? I said, I don't break things or scream and yell or hit anybody or do this or that. And John said, you're full of crap, Bill. You're full of pride. He goes, your pride's talking now. Yeah, just because you weren't like your dad and you didn't break things and scream and yell and hit. He says they sense it when you're hating them and you get mad and you get all tense up. They sense it. They know it. You can't fool them. Like Josh McDowell said, you can fool a fool, you can con a con, but you can't kid a kid. Kids know. And she says that they know that you're, even though you're not saying or doing anything, that your hatred's inside. He says, so you need to, tell them, listen, I'm going to go outside and deal with this stuff and come back. The saddest story that I know of someone not really dealing with their hatred and stuff, and it was, I got a call from a mom, and her daughter was 38 years old, seeking counseling for her daughter for depression. And she actually wanted me to go to the daughter's house because the daughter wouldn't come out of the house, and she pulled the shades. And I said, I'm not going to the house. I said, tell her if she wants counseling, she needs to get up. She needs to take a shower. She needs to get dressed and come to the office. Just that in itself is therapeutic. Now the counseling that I do, I'm not a psychiatrist. And if she was on medication or anything for depression, that's a different story. But these would come in cycles for her, and Pam taught me this. If someone that I was counseling, what I do is biblical counseling. I relate pastoral counseling. I relate their situations to their relationship with the Lord and go in that direction. Sometimes people say, well, I'm feeling better, I'm going to get off my medication. I tell them, if you're going to get off your medication, I'm not going to see you unless you have a doctor's note that you can get off your medication, because the medication a lot of times with depression is necessary. But in this girl's case, she was dealing with hatred and self-pity, and those fuel the depression. You see, she had married interracially, and her family they didn't like that, and everyone disowned her. Her family disowned her. Now, her brother was the big shot of the family, had a big house, and during the holidays, he would host family parties, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and it was a big house and big parties and catered. He was a big shot, and she nor her kids would ever get invited. She had two children. Then the man that she married actually cheated on her with an underage girl and got thrown in jail. So that just fueled the family's fire. Like, we were right, what a loser, and you're a loser, and you mixed races and your kids are not welcome here. So as we talked and as I gathered information, I finally said to her, I said, I get it. You hate your brother. And you could see just in her body language, all this stuff rose within her. And you can really see it like almost rising to the surface. And you ever see people that get that bump in the middle of their forehead, like an anger bump? It's a literal thing. I've seen it a lot. They get like this bump that comes out when, and all of a sudden, she masked all that over. You could see, pushed it back down. She put on this smile and said, I don't hate him. I pray for him. And I thought, oh, that's nice. I said, but I wanted to give her permission. I said, well, I'd hate him. He rejected you. I said, and he rejected your kids. Now you reject me, I'll hate you, but you reject my kids, you hurt my kids, then I'm really going to hate you. I'm going to want to kill you. And she wouldn't bite. She said, no, 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 no. So I said, all right. So she came back the next week and everything was fine because she met a guy. It's always a guy. So she meets a guy and she's happy because this guy loves her. And I wanted her to continue with the counseling, and she said she would, but she never came back because she found someone to love her and make her feel better and make her feel good. Well, the next call that I got from the mom and the sister, which was a couple years later, was, could I officiate her funeral? She had drank herself to death. She had gone into a deep depression, and the family was kind of used to it. And they had dealt with this before, where she'd pull the shade, she shut off the lights, and the dad would go and knock on the door. She wouldn't answer. They'd call her. She wouldn't answer, and then she'd come out of it. But she was alone, she was dead in the house for 17 days. And it just was really sad because her personality and her character traits was there was a sweetness and the kindness about her and the new person that she was in Jesus Christ. But that was very, very sad. And stuffing can never do it. Now, when we bring on the panel, we'll talk about, I think the AA, the big book, has one of the best tools in dealing with this, which is a resentment list. And a resentment list, especially if you've been stuffing hatred for years, the resentment list has to unpeel all that. And I remember when my experience with it was, as a Christian, I'm not going to hate anybody. As a Christian, you're not supposed to be offended. You're supposed to forgive. And a lot of times that forgiveness is superficial if we don't acknowledge the hurt. If we don't acknowledge the pain. There's legitimate anger. There's legitimate hurts that we experience. So I remember when I first got involved in going to the Alpha series, I had been a Christian in church for 13 years, and I got involved with the Alpha series. And the recovery people had something I wanted. I didn't really know at the time what it was, but a lot of it made sense. And I asked a friend of mine, his name was Billy Precious. I said, listen, will you, like, I want to do the 12 steps. I said, I'm not an alcoholic. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't go with girls that do. I said, I'm codependent. I probably have a sexual addiction. I said, and he said, yeah. He goes, but are you willing to be honest and do whatever it takes? I said, yeah. So we went through, step one, and I never admitted I was powerless. I always thought that, well, I have to be a good Christian, and I have to, be strong for God or whatever. So I acknowledged my powerlessness. He said that, over this last 13 years, you've tried to, believe that God would restore you to sanity. But if you don't understand that you're powerless, then you think that you can do something. So then step 2 was good. Step 3, yeah, I've been trying. But when we got to step 4, he said that he wanted me to do an inventory. So the first week I came back, I wrote a whole biographical sketch of my acting out with codependency and using girls and sexuality, sexual stuff to take the edge off. And I talked about all that stuff, and I wrote it all out. He goes, well, that's not the, and he goes, in addition to this inventory that you did, this biographical sketch, I want you to do a resentment list. And he explained it to me. And I said, nah, I don't, I'm easygoing. I'm a nice guy. I said, I'm pretty easygoing. I don't have resentments. I don't hate anybody. He kind of looked at me. He said, really? He said, listen, if you don't do this, we'll just stop right here and go have a nice life without me. Like basically, they use the term in AA sometimes. He says, I'm going to fire you. So he said he'd fire me. I said, well, what, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. And he says, listen, get before God, ask God to show you. Write down who you're resenting, why you're resenting him, your part in it, and how God sees the whole thing. So I prayed about it, and God laid it down. I think when the student is ready, the teacher appears. I had about 5 pages of resentments. People, institutions, like the IRS was on there. So I had all these resentments, and I went through it in my 5th step with Billy, and it was just like all of a sudden all this stuff lifted off of me. And I noticed that after that, if I was angry and needed to talk about it or express it, I got better at doing that. And what I noticed, and it was like this in my first marriage, I would clam up and I would back down from confrontation. And the reason was, and I remember my first wife said like that I was a wimp or, pushover or something. And I always did. I always totally backed down. But what I realized that I was afraid, because if I didn't back down, I was going to blow up and in a rage. And I had done it early on, breaking things and smashing things. So I was afraid of this rage that was in me. So I never dealt with anger, never expressed it. So then I found myself like, an example is I went to the car place. I had to get my car done, and I told the guy not to do anything unless they talked to me first. So I went, and they replaced something that I could have easily replaced myself and charged me like, I don't know, $64 an hour. And I said, listen, I'm not paying that. I told you. Now, usually I would have just paid it and went off pissed off and angry. But I found that after I did my resentment list and was able, I expressed my anger. Like I said, listen, I asked you not to replace anything, not to do any work on this car unless you called me first. Oh, well, and I stuck to my guns. I said, I want the labor taken off of there. So the guy said, all right, well, then we'll go take the part out. I said, go ahead. He was bluffing me. I said, go take the part out. And I was calm. I wasn't hating them. I just said, listen, I was going back and forth with them. In the past, I just would have paid it and just backed out and, probably took it out on somebody else, right? So I noticed that benefit of doing the inventory. And then, step 10 is dealing with that. A while back, when was it? In early November, I had to do another whole resent because I hadn't been 10-stepping it, and I let things pile up. And Martin and I did a 5th step with Martin after dealing with my resentments. But that hatred will take its toll. So remember what we're trying to do in applying the gospel and walking out the gospel is we're trying to, if you look at the categories of emotions, the fruits of the spirit are at the top, supernatural emotions, that we have love, joy, and peace. And then we have positive emotions depending on our circumstances. If my wife is treating me nice, I'm going to feel all sorts of love towards her. If good things happen, then I'm happy. Happenings depends on happening. I'm content if I'm well fed and I have money in the bank and I know that tomorrow everything's going to be honky-dory. Now, the negative emotions of anger, anguish, and concern, those are where we spend a lot of time emotionally. Anger can immediately slip to hatred. Anguish can slip to self-pity. Concern can slip to anxiety. So when we experience a negative emotions, how do we go from anger and even in the midst of the anger, jump up to the supernatural and still have an element of love? Or when we're hurt, that we can still feel joy. Or when there's bad circumstances, we can still have peace. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about anger first, but what we're going to do is before we talk about anger, we have to, if you've been stuffing your anger for a long time, we have to talk about hatred. Now, Jesus gave the recipe. We're going to talk about the resentment list in the big book when we bring everybody on, but it's right in the gospel too. It's in the gospel. And Jesus talked about hatred. There's this passage in Matthew 18 where the disciples are arguing over who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of God. And Matthew and Luke report that, I mean, this argument that they were having, they were at each other's throats. In the Greek language, James, John, Peter, they were at each other's throats about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And what that meant is the anticipation, the expectation was they knew Jesus was the king. Now, in their mind, even in the book of Acts in chapter 1, they still were saying, when are you going to, in their mind, their idea, even though there was tons of verses in the Old Testament that said otherwise, they just focused on that this Messiah was going to make Israel the ruler of all the world again. So in order to do that, in Jesus' time, you had to get rid of Rome. So their expectation that was Jesus was going to kick butt and take names on the Romans and set up this kingdom where Jesus was going to be the king, the ruler. So they figured, well, Jesus has been training us and teaching us this whole time. Someone's going to be his right-hand man, and that's what they were arguing about. Who's going to be Jesus' right-hand man? Who's going to be vice president? Who's going to be next in line? Who's going to have the power? That's what they were arguing about. And they were, I mean, you look at what these punk politicians do for power. They'll kill, pillage, destroy to get power. So that's what these guys were kind of brawling about. They were angry, they were full of hatred, and they wanted the power. And Jesus says to them, he says, listen, he takes a little child and he sits the child on his lap and he says, listen, he says, you got to change and become like little children. You'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. He said, whoever becomes like a child is the greatest. You want to be great? And he says, whoever welcomes his child in my name. So Jesus took this child, and we picture Jesus taking this child, putting this child on his lap, loving that child. So if you want to be great, men, you have to sit up in God's lap and let him love you like a little child. You have to admit that you're a lost little boy and stop the con that I'm so tough and rough and tumble, right? Without Jesus Christ, I know that I'm a scared, weak little man. That's all there is to it. So then he goes on, and this is what he says, and there's some harsh language in here, but when we really dissect it, you're going to see that it's dealing with hatred. Oh, wrong scripture, sorry. He says, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Now, right there, people say, see, you talk about this loving God and grace. He's going to drown me in the sea. No, that's not what he said. He said it would be better, right? It would be better for him. God's not saying that he's going to do this to the person. God's not saying he's going to do that to you. No way is God saying that. So then Jesus says, woe to the world because of things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through who they come. Now, I want you to look at when he says that it causes one of these little ones to sin. What he's really talking about is going to cause one of these little ones to harden his heart. It's going to cause one of these little ones to turn away from God. It's going to cause one of these little ones to hate. Now, what would cause a little one to harden his heart, turn away from God, and hate? Pain, suffering. So he's saying to any adult that's going to inflict pain on a child, it would be better for them. It would be better for them to tie a millstone around the neck. If I went down, took my brother-in-law's boat into the intercoastal and got a huge millstone. These things were big. So we don't have any of those. So say a Cadillac. Say that I went down and got on a big boat, a big barge that carried Cadillacs across the ocean. And I tied the rope to my neck, and I tied it to a Cadillac. And then they drove the Cadillac off the ramp of the boat into the water. My neck would break immediately, and I'd be dead in a second. And that's what Jesus is saying. It would be better to die a quick death than the slow, agonizing death you're going to die through hatred. Hatred and bitterness will cause people to die a slow, agonizing death. You're not living. You're not alive. You're walking dead if you're full of hatred and bitterness. That's what he's saying. That's all he's saying. God's not saying he's going to drown you in the sea, tie a millstone on your neck. He's saying it would be you'd be better off than live in this miserable death, because we know that hatred and bitterness eventually takes its toll on your body. Okay, research shows that your immune system suffers, and people that have faith and that have joy and peace and love, they do much better. Their immune systems are better. So that's what Jesus is saying. But he goes on to say, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled, or to have 2 feet and be thrown into the... It says eternal fire here, and that word eternal is not in the original Greek. I copied and pasted from the NIV here. So we're going to talk about that. And if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes to be thrown into the fire of hell. Okay, so in verse 8, that word eternal is not there, because we mix this up a lot. We think that Jesus is saying, man, you're going to go to hell, if you don't call it, and it's been translated that, your hand, you steal with your hand. So if you steal, you should cut your hand. That's not what he's talking about. Now, the fire that he's talking about in the Greek language, in the Greek, all it says is, it is better for you to cut off your hand and enter life maimed, and instead of going into the fire of Gehenna, the fires of Gehenna. Now, Gehenna, in Jesus' time, you have to look at this in the context. Gehenna was this trash dump. There was this valley where it was they burned the trash, and they kept it burning. Right? They didn't have garbage men and garbage cans and garbage pickup, so they'd throw. Now, if somebody died and they didn't have a plot, and if criminals died and they had nowhere to bury them, they would throw their bodies into Gehenna. So you ever, like I've been a school teacher my whole life, but did a parent ever say this to a kid, or a teacher ever say this? If you keep acting like that, you're going to wind up in jail. right? You're going to wind up in jail. You say that to people. You're going to wind up in jail. Don't do that or you're going to wind up in jail. Don't act like that. You're going to wind up in jail. Well, it's the same thing. The fires of Gehenna, people that were thrown over there were considered worthless and disposable by society. So Jesus is saying, cut off your hand, deal with this stuff. If you don't deal with this stuff, your life's going to be worthless. You're going to wind up in jail. You're going to wind up being thrown into the fires of Gehenna. That's going to be the end of your life. Miserable, worthless, no good. Wasn't threatening hell here. That's a whole nother topic. But it's important to understand that what Jesus is saying here, he's talking about life here. We get so hooked in to heaven or hell, so hooked into the afterlife, we almost think that God doesn't care about this life here. Eternal life begins now. The quality of life and joy and peace and fellowship that we can have with God begins now. So he was talking about this life. He was talking about the ramifications and where someone would wind up in the trash dump if they don't deal with their hatred. Saying, deal with that hatred. And the best way is to start with being honest, being brutally honest with God about it. Okay? Be brutally honest with God. God, he does not read the Psalms. There's passages in the Psalms where David's asking God to go to his enemy and take the enemy's babies and bash their heads on the rock. Full of, God knows. It doesn't take him by surprise. He's not shocked by your hatred. He's the only one that can deal with it. He's the only one that can take it. Now, we're going to talk about this later when we get into Romans 7. But just now know that there's a big difference between the new person that you are in Christ and this thing that the scriptures call the flesh, right? So those that have been through the Alpha series and know what I'm talking about and sit under John's teaching about the flesh, it's not you that's hating. It's not the real you. It's the flesh that's full of hatred. So you can let yourself off the hook and you can even tell God, my flesh right now is hating. Receive God's forgiveness for your hatred. Forgive the one that hurt you and leave it there. God will deal with it. Your emotions might not change, but you tell God as an act of my will, I forgive this person. Now, a lot of times there's spiritual warfare involved in this. The principalities and powers, Satan, the principalities and powers, the demons, they love to stir up the hatred. So if you really want to get rid of that and set all those principalities and powers flying out of your sight, here's what you say. Whoever the person that is, you say, Lord God, I'm powerless over this hatred, but as an act of my will, as I turn my life and will over to you, I know that you forgive that person. As an act of my will, I forgive them. Not only, Lord, do I forgive them, but based on the gospel of Jesus Christ, I declare them righteous and holy and blameless in your sight. Whew. You want to see some of that stuff disappear? When you declare the gospel openly, out loud. A.W. Tozer has a book called I Talk Back to the Devil, and in it he says, listen, the devil is not omniscient. The devil doesn't know what you're thinking. The devil doesn't know what you're believing. The principalities and powers do not have omniscience. I don't know whether they can just observe what we're doing physically or what we're saying, but when we declare out loud, Lord, I forgive that person, not only do I forgive them, I declare them on the basis and the authority that you've given us as believers, Jesus Christ, I declare them righteous and holy and blameless in your sight. And you can take a deep breath, and God will begin dealing with that hatred, because the power of salvation and the power of salvation from your hatred is in the gospel of Jesus Christ. You're powerless over it. You're not going to do anything, but you come into agreement with God and you watch him miraculously work in your life. I was going to talk about anxiety a little bit, but I feel like we should just leave it there with dealing with the hatred, and dealing with being honest with God, right? So what I mean by that is if my son or daughter or wife or my students, if someone hurts me and disappoints me and I'm hating them, I can stuff it, or I could blow up on them and lash back, or I could be honest with God, go to God, bring it to God and tell God, I'm hating so-and-so, and tell them why. And don't be afraid. Don't use the King's English. Give it to God with both barrels, because that's what walking in the light is. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin, it says in 1 John. Now notice, cleansing is different from forgiveness, right? Cleansing is different from forgiveness. Cleansing is separating us from our flesh and giving us a pure vision of the new person that you are in Christ. In our neighborhood, there was this empty lot, and when it would rain, we would go. We loved when it rained. We would go play mud football, and we would get muddy, play tackle football in the mud. We loved it. Well, when I came home, my mom would say, "Go to the back porch," and she'd have the hose, because we had all this mud all over us. And she would say, "Don't come in this house." Now, she wasn't rejecting us. She was rejecting the mud, right? "Don't come in this house." She'd hose us down, and then she'd say, "All right." She'd let us just sit there and drip off a little. And then we'd go right into the laundry room and drop our clothes there. And she'd give us a towel, right? So that the clothes weren't so muddy. She'd hose us down. She'd cleanse us so that we can enter in. So when it says, as we walk in the light as he is in the light, walking in the light is that part, being honest about God. Walking in the light is being honest about your flesh, being honest about your hatred. And as we tell God, I'm telling you, God speaks to us, right? For me anyway, my experience is when I'm telling God I'm hating, God's telling me, no, you don't. The new person that you are loves that person, cares for that person, right? I remember even one time, early on, Carrie and I had a fight, and she was mad. She was so mad at me. I don't know what. I don't think she said she hated me. "I can't stand you," is what she said. And I said, "That's not true." Thank you. Thank you, Grace.
Yeah.
I said, "That's not true that you can't stand me." I said, "The fact is, the new person that you are loves me, forgives me. The new person that you are is crazy about me." That's what I told her, just like that. All right, so I'm going to bring the panel on. That's where I feel like we should stop and really cast your burdens upon the Lord, for he cares for you. God invites us daily to cast our burdens on him. And hatred's a burden. Hating somebody is a burden. So if we tell God and they're honest, not the person, there's been times when people didn't even know I was mad at them. So I went and I just let it all out to God. And then he gave me peace and really showed me so many times the whole thing was my fault anyway. I'm talking quiet because I don't want the rest of the family to hear me say that. I'd give up power if I did that. All right, let's bring you on. Bring on the panel. So it's not a fun subject to talk about, but I seem to be having a little fun with it. I don't know, getting it off my chest. Dave, why don't we start with you tonight?
Okay, thank you all.
Your experience.
Yeah. Wow, that was very good. Thank you, Bill. So my experiences, Bill touched on a lot of it. Didn't know that I had all this anger, and coming into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous 12 Steps, you know, it focuses after you walk through the first 3 steps, we're powerless, or, you know, our lives are unmanageable. We come to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. We make a decision, and then we go on to this 4th step. And this 4th step in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is broken into 3 major sections. The very first one is resentment. And in the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it says that resentment is the number 1 offender to the alcoholic. In other words, it causes us more problems, according to what the book tells us, more problems than fear and harms we've done others, which is the sexual harms as well. So then starting to learn the Alpha series and a new person, we're a new person that God's created in us, a new person to put to death the old person, but yet we have the flesh, which is where this stuff is stored at, our conscious and subconscious mind. Learning about the Alpha series made it easier for me to deal with the resentments, because then it was a separation between who I am and what was stored in the flesh. It wasn't me. That old person was crucified. Now, I may be jumping ahead a little bit in this, but so let me back up.
Help it though.
So once I started working the 12, the step 4, and wrote down my resentments, which I had a lot. Again, I was kind of like Bill. I didn't think I hated. I didn't. But what I was a person that walked around before Alcoholics Anonymous, before the Alpha series, before Identity. I walked around and stuffing all of that, stuffing all of my anger, stuffing all of my hatred, because where I came from mentally was that I didn't measure up to anybody. I was an outcast. I felt like I had no identity. I had no significance for being on this earth. I just couldn't. And alcohol, gave me a sense of worth, false sense of worth, but it gave it to me. But then when that failed, and then I had to deal with the solution to my problem, because I couldn't live anymore. Alcohol had trapped me to the point where I couldn't drink, or I could not drink. And so I had to deal with it. So working on through the 12, the 4th step on my resentments, getting freed up from some of them, learning about the identity of who I am, learning how to walk that out on a daily basis. And then somebody would cross me. Somebody would say something. Somebody would do something. Whether they intended to hurt me or not, I felt hurt, and I got resentful, and I got angry. And when I first started learning about this, I didn't realize what was happening to me. I was stuffing it again. I was burying it underneath, saying that, that I'm a Christian, and I forgive them, and this words I was saying, but it wasn't penetrating in the depths of my soul. So I had to build up a bunch of resentments, a bunch of hatred again, and then blow up like a bomb. And then finally, God got my attention, and going back through the 12 steps again, going back through a 4th step, cleaning out the past again, and then finally understood that I have to look at this daily, or at least weekly, or and now today, and what I mean by look at it, what I have to do is when somebody offends me or I get offended by something during the day as I'm walking out my life, I have to look at it. And the first thing my flesh wants to do is hate them because you hurt me. You did, it just immediately wants to do that. And I recognize that today. Am I instantaneous? Not always. Am I sometimes? Yes. What I mean by that is I have to acknowledge the fact that was angry and I'm hating. And I need to ask God to forgive me for my hatred in this situation and then give me the ability to, well, as Bill put it very, very, very nicely, how to believe the gospel for myself and believe it for others, or another, specifically that particular situation. I like the way Bill put that. That was real well. But for my MO has typically been, forgive me, Lord, for hating this person, and then try to clear my sin for what I've jumped onto, which is hating. But this is, for me, this is something that I immediately do. Now, I'm going to share this a little bit too. In my past, before Christ, before the 12 steps, before identity, the Alpha series, my MO was to, in a fight or flight situation, was to run away from it. And literally just did not want confrontation, did not want fights, just back down on everything. Working on myself a little bit, that has changed. Today, Bill made an example of this in what he said, but for me, it was kind of the opposite. Today, I can boldly stand for my rights and what is right and what is wrong. I don't have to back down and walk away, but I have to be careful that I don't go into self-righteousness. So for me, this dealing with hatred, dealing with this is not something you deal with one time. It's something I have to look at and deal with constantly, daily. I have to be aware. I'm not like I walk around and hate the guy that turned in front of me when I was, or something like that. But I have to watch myself, and I have to be aware when it's going on. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dave. Before, I just want to look at this question here. How do you define hate? Sincere question of pondering due to events in your life. The hatred that we're talking about, we're not just talking about an emotion. I had thought about this, and I thought about the gospel and how Jesus Christ sets us free. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Love sets you free. Hatred sometimes looks like control. You try to control that person, you try to control the circumstances, you try to control the person from. So I think one manifestation that I always think about is controlling people. You want to control them. You want to dictate. A dictator is full of hate. But also with the hatred, how to define it, I think we would all have a different connotation on hatred. It's that feeling that wells up inside you where you want hurt somebody, you want revenge on somebody, or you just keep rehearsing the hurt over and over again. I think hate and self-pity are two sides of the same coin. So I don't know if that helps. Nicey Pie. Nicey Pie? I don't know what. That's a good name. Pam, you're up. You're up at bat.
Oh boy. Thanks, Bill. I'm going to kind of look at this from a different angle just because you said something about flip sides of the same coin. I make an argument. I'm not saying it's right, But I can make an argument that actually human love and human hate are flip sides of the same coin. That whatever feeds my feelings of self worth, I quote unquote love, and whatever exacerbates what I call the black hole, the emptiness, makes me feel worth less. That's what I hate. So in the flesh, the flip side, I said the opposite of love, and again, I'm not talking about agape. Um, the opposite of love in this argument is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference.
Oh,
Okay.
like that.
Um, because again, and I know you've had the same experience. How many times have I, much less people I work with, the people I hate this year were the people I claimed to love a couple of years before, or days or weeks or whatever. We won't go into that. But you can't do marriage and divorce and relationship and that kind of stuff for any length of time at all before you realize that the primary people that you hate were the ones that you claim to love.
Yeah.
Why is that? Well, because they were the ones who had the most power over your feelings of self-worth. And so when they fail to fulfill that role, much less make you feel worth less, you hate them. I kind of wanted to pick up where Dave left off with the big book. He was reading for a direct quote. That exact direct quote goes on to say about resentment, from it stem all forms of spiritual disease. And then on the next page, and again, still talking about resentment, it says, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We have found it is fatal. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the spirit.
Oh,
Yeah. So in this line of thought, the other part of hate is fear. And you were talking about how your people watching or whatever dissipate after you talk about the subject. They never use the term hate, and they never use the term forgiveness in the big book. In the first 164 pages. Terms never used. Also, gratitude, by the way, is never used. And I believe that they avoid the topic of hate and forgiveness just for that reason. They just don't even want to get into the argument.
yeah.
It takes too much time.
Yeah.
Okay. To try and convince somebody that, yes, they really do. Hey, when some people believe you go to hell for that.
Yeah.
So anyway, having been a heathen when I did my fourth step, I didn't have anywhere near as much trouble admitting this as Christians do. In fact, I had a lot of what I consider to be self-righteous anger. Yeah, I had multiple pages too. And another part of my theory in this is that, and it comes from my personal experience, is that people are either fear people or they are anger people. That's their go-to emotion. And I've worked with so many people. You will hear them say, no, I don't have any fear. That was me. I don't do fear. I had 68 names on my anger list, but I don't have any fear. Or you will hear people say, no, I don't have any anger. All I have is fear. And I contend that basically those experiences of those emotions come from the same root. And that is that empty place, that overwhelming, for lack of a better term, I will call fear that I truly am worthless. And when I have anything that affirms that fear, I hate. Thanks.
All right.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, Pam, what do you think of the idea? Because of anger really being fear-based, anger being fear in disguise or a secondary reaction to fear.
Okay, see, that's kind of what I'm alluding to. You'll hear people say it in the program all the time, that the opposite of love is not hate, it's fear. Well, I don't, you can get crazy because you got to know what your definition of love is. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's something that we have to settle first. So we're not talking about that tonight. That's why I said, well, I'm talking about fleshly love. I'm not talking, so I was trying to be clear about that. So as far as I'm concerned, when we have that paradigm, then hate is absolutely nothing except fear.
Yeah.
It is the emotion that is engendered in me when something affirms my fear that I truly am worthless.
Right. Yeah. 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 And the other thing, when you talked about the indifference, two things come to mind. And there's that old joke that, if you're arguing with your wife and she says, fine, do whatever you want, but then you're in trouble. Like, fine, I don't care, but when the indifference, there's a line in a movie, I forget the movie, but the husband, no, it wasn't the husband and wife, but they were having this argument, and the guy said, he said to his wife, no, it was his ex-wife, and the wife was fighting with her new husband. And he said to her, if we would have had fights like that, we probably would have still been together. Right? Because when you're fighting, you're arguing, you still care. You're still passionate about that relationship. And then the other thing is that when you talked about hatred, indifference, or hatred and love being two sides of the same coin, that I thought of, the closer you are to a person, the more they can hurt you. Like if some guy on the street said, hey, Bill, you're ugly, you got a big nose, and I think that guy over there is cuter than you, I'd say, I don't care what you think. If Carrie said that to me, man, I would hate her in a minute, right? Mm-hmm. So I got you on that. I got you. Jim, you're up on up to bat.
Right. I'd like to start off with the defense mechanisms, natural defense mechanisms of the flesh. The first one is denial, which is probably, in my opinion, the biggest one. You got denial, projection, and rationalization. When the Lord or when somebody, when the button's getting pushed or someone's putting their finger on the issue, when it comes to hatred, because of the hatred and the pain, the hurt and the fear all go together, they're all involved in that. The first thing the flesh is going to want to do is deny it. When I first started I did a 4th step just because I was working the steps. And the first time I did it was a long time ago. The first time I did it, I did a fearful, searching and fearful moral inventory because I was scared shitless because I wasn't ready. Okay. I was just trying to do it because it's step 4. I don't think it was time for me to do it yet. Because I didn't make a resentment list. I added another list to that is regrets. I got resentments and regrets. And when you start, examining yourself, really getting honest with yourself, I found most of my stuff, I was hating myself more than other people because of the expectations I've never met on myself. Ways that the hatred would come for me because I was so legalistic or perfectionism. I'm always trying to. I was living under some sort of a law system. So there's expectations on myself that I couldn't meet. Or there's expectations on others that they couldn't meet my expectations. So those who fail are unworthy of love and deserve to be punished was my thinking. So I'd end up hating them. If it didn't benefit me some way, somehow, then I don't need you. So now, after years and years of I kind of just, I don't know, maybe for 20 years, I was planted at Freedom Ranch. So I was hearing the truth on a regular basis of who God said He'd made me to be in Christ. And then now that I'm finally starting to believe it, I'm at a different stage with the step 4 and 5. Because now it's easier for me to get honest about the flesh because it's not me. Before it was me, and it left me vulnerable, and it's a sign of weakness, and real men don't cry and all that crap. So I'm at a different stage with it now. It's deeper and it's more. I don't know the word. What the Lord tells me though, when my flesh will flash, like Dave was talking, the first thing the Lord reminds me is that's not me. It's the flesh. Because if I bite on that and I see myself as my flesh, then I'm immediately going to be condemned for it and ashamed. And it's not me, it's just the nature of the flesh. That's not who I am anymore. And the flesh is never going to believe, ever. It's never going to be satisfied, ever. It's always in competition. It always has expectations. It's always self-centered. And that's not who I am. That's not who we are. So when we separate who we are from it, there's half of the battle right there. One. So I spent a lot of years trying to change my behavior, change the outside of the cup. And then finally, the Lord has me, I've got motives written down. It's not what we do, it's why are we doing what we're doing. So all the time, it doesn't matter what it is. So to walk in the light as he is in the light is to see both sides. You see that you're the new man that's always believing, never sinning, always loving. And then you also see the flesh that's totally the opposite. Okay? It took a long time for me to grasp that. So step 4 and 5, I wrote down here when you are ready. Because, and it's also an ongoing process. It's not just something you're going to do one time and that's it, I'm done. It's all clean. I got the way that the Lord showed me where I could receive it better. He kind of simplified it. He simply just said, weed the garden. Because you can get all the weeds, you can cultivate, get all the weeds out of your garden, your whatever, vegetables you're growing, whatever it is you're growing, plants, flowers, you get every weed out of there and it's looking beautiful for a little bit. And then the weeds start growing again. So you got to go back if you want it to stay looking good and healthy, you got to go back and weed the garden. So I looked at step 4 and 5 as this real scary thing until he showed me it's just simply weeding the garden or clean the house. Sometimes there's dust on the windowsill. You know, you can do the major stuff that you see, but there's hidden stuff under the furniture, behind the bed. You know, the windowsills, and like in the Marine Corps, it was the white glove they'd get out, and if they find something, you'd have to do it over. So the Lord does the same thing with us over time. It's a little bit at a time. He can't do it all at once. It'll kill us. You can't do it all at once. It's like layer of an onion, you know, it's a layer at a time. So that's it.
Yeah. You know, Kara and I were talking about that this morning. Just the process. God talks about changing us from glory to glory. You know, you really made a good segue, Jim, into, you know, kind of the next couple weeks. It's hard to talk about that hatred without really understanding your true identity. In fact, you won't really be able to do it. And, you know, when we talk about an inventory, I used to draw a picture when we were over at Whitestone of you and Jesus looking at the flesh. You know, and doing the inventory. You and Jesus are looking at that because the new person that you are, is under attack by the flesh, the world, and the devil. The new person that you are is totally separate. But in fact, Bob Dylan had a song that he wrote called "The Neighborhood Bully," and it was about the flesh. It was about the works of the flesh in our lives. So that'll be good. We'll cover next week. We're going to cover the Solomon syndrome, and then we're going to go right into Romans 6, 7, and 8. And so when we get into Romans 6, 7, and 8, when we get to Romans 7 and Paul's struggle with the flesh, you'll see that struggle. We'll take another look at hatred, because I really think you can just apply, when I want to love other people, I don't. When I want to love other people, I wind up hating them, and that struggle that he had, and it's really understanding your new identity. So really it brings us back full circle to lesson 1. Who are you? What's your identity? All right. So that's all for tonight. I want to thank everyone for joining in. I noticed that I have the control switches here, and for some reason we were on the YouTube page, the reach page, but Facebook's doing something weird where you have to type something in. So I don't think it went up on the Alpha Ministries page till halfway through. So we'll share it on the page again. But again, thank you everyone for joining us. We will be Nisi Pi. We will be here again next Thursday night. Same time. We're here every Thursday night, 7 p.m. Okay, and we'll be here next Thursday. Freedom Ranch is up and running, 11 a.m. Reach Community Church, 9 a.m. at the Causeway. Don't forget, you're going to turn your clocks ahead. Remember to do that. So you're going to get there at 11 a.m., but it's going to feel like what, 10 a.m. or 12 a.m.? I don't know. 12 p.m. I don't know. I don't like this. So I get up early and go to the gym, but now it's going to be like I'm getting up at 3:30. So, all right. Love you guys. Thanks for joining. We'll see everybody next week at 7 p.m. unless we see you out at the ranch or on the Causeway. Have a good night.